We got into journal editing by an accident. I mean, I'd barely published an article, and we had this piece out on liminality on in Nigerian television comedy that had been out from 1983 to 1986 or 7 with the journal. Actually, with 1984 to 1987. And so it was about, we had submitted this for imminent publication in June 1984. I'd actually got promotion on the fact that it was accepted, as had Harriet, and there was a few other things were accepted, but I had not seen it in print. And I rang up the editor in November 87, I think it was, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm going crazy here. The administration at first supported me and then expected me to just to produce the journal myself with only one assistant, and I do all the editing. I'm the person who got back the library subscriptions by writing to each one of the 300 libraries that had been advised by the previous editor to give up the subscription because Anthropologic would never appear again. I've done all this stuff. I set the journal on the computer, and I'm behindhand. And the administrator tells me he doesn't understand my problem. He worked for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it appears in time all the time. So what's wrong with you? Tell me. He's telling me I've got to get rid of the journal. Will you take it on? But I know nothing of journal editing. Believe me, nor did I when I took it on. So Catherine Molahan offered to pass it on. So I went to the relatively amiable vice president of Laurier, who himself had solved the problem of publishing when he became dean after publishing just 2 articles. And his wife had, somewhat intoxicated at a faculty party, said, now he's dean, he won't have to publish his 3rd article. So here he was, and he thought it would be great if Laurier got a journal. And there was consultation with the head of the press, Sandra Wolfrey, and she said we needed someone more senior than me, and my friend Matthias had published a lot more than me or Harriet, so he ought to be the managing editor. And that way, the 3 of us, 3 of the 4, 3 of the 5 in the program, would take over the journal. And we'd run the journal with the press that would take it on. Well, we had a huge backlog. The journal had started out 3 years beforehand, and it had never caught up, although it had not got any worse. And there were 2 or 3 issues getting ready. So in 1 year, in 3 years, we had to get the journal back to time. Well, we never got closer than 4 months, but we did reduce it from 3 years to 4 months. But when we applied for Shirk, we essentially got a message, screw off. And at that time, the university withdrew support, so that I was in the end left alone with the journal after Matthias gave up after 4 or 5 years and Harriet moved to UW. I got some help from Harriet and from a member of the Precariat, Callan Charles-Melech, who did a sterling job. Stan Barrett and Regner and Jean-Marc were still there. But basically, I was carrying the Ken for 4 difficult years. I tried to merge it with culture, but the head of it, who was, what was her name, Margaret Seguin Anderson at Weston, didn't want to be bothered. It was hostile to us. Eventually, however, Culture had difficulty with its publisher and approached Wilfrid Laurier Press. And I was called in by the head of the press. What do you think? Your rivals want to publish with us. I said, I've got another suggestion. We have got lots of library subscriptions, but no, very few individual subscriptions. They've got the Casca membership, but no libraries. If we merge, and libraries still counted at that time, we still have quite a few, we have a viable journal. So she called in Christine Jourdain, and we agreed to a merger. And I thought I was rid of Anthropologica for life, though I'd quite enjoyed being the only Anglo journal that still published structuralism into the 1990s, because none of our people were really up to date. And we got some quite actually really interesting articles in those days. A marvellous issue on deviance from the Counts. Karen Charlemagne did one on fisheries. We got this marvellous piece by Bernard that Joan Philibert translated on third sex and Inuit shamans, and a piece by Edith Turner, some of David Howe's first publications on the sensorium. So we, got a bit, and then we amalgamated. I bowed out, Harriet bowed out. Then a few years later, I got called back to help Winnie Lamb by being the managing editor, but really the copy editor, which was a thankless job, but it gave me something to do when I was in a sort of hiatus just after the book. And then, just when I was already committed to retiring, I got called back to be editor of Anthropologica, this time the former Culture, for 3 years. And that was an interesting experience, because we had a huge backlog when I came, right, this time not the journal being late, but a whole load of piled up issues that had to be published in a hurry. And the journal now is in the hands of a very good friend of ours, an ex-colleague of both of us, someone who's taught both at Laurier and at University of Waterloo. She's the editor-in-chief, Jasmine Habib. And her friend at Laurier, Alicia Slewinski, who is a Montrealer, is a Francophone editor. So in a certain sense, Waterloo has continued to have an unusual connection to the journal. We face a number of problems that possibly are faced by academic journals everywhere, but particularly in Canada. Editors can get no cost relief for editing a journal. It is not treated as a valid research contribution. It is not treated as something that accrues to the prestige of a university. The university presses are increasingly themselves marginalized. Laurier Press, which stopped publishing Anthropologica, it's been handed over to U of T, was nearly damned by a financial report, one of these new priorities exercises, program priorities exercises. We have a problem with getting as many good articles as we'd like to get because of ranking systems whereby Canadian journals are ranked low, usually on American-based and biased ranking systems, which we discussed earlier. And when we have special issues, I cannot speak for Jasmine's experience, there is terrific pressure to publish everything that we receive. And there's a definite tone we sometimes get with dealing with the more elite institutions that their faculty do us a favor by publishing with us, and that if they deign to submit anything to us, we have to submit it, and damn the criticisms. We should publish it. We should be grateful to get whatever they offer us. And so that is an issue that we face. And that is partly the result of the metrics used by promotion and tenure committees. But it is also a result of, I think, a sense of inferiority. I don't know whether this is in Francophone Canada, but in Anglophone Canada, about anything that is published in Canada. If it's published in Canada, it must be inferior to what is published in the American Anthropologist, Man and Cultural Anthropology. And that is a reality. And, despite that, I can point to this or that article as absolutely excellent. But there's always a sense of worry that we won't quite have enough, and we always just get by in the end. But there's always a feeling that we might not. And it's really frustrating to publish somebody's work, to publish a good piece of work by a young scholar, and put in the work that goes into helping edit the work, and bring it to print, and know that that work on your part is not appreciated, and that a review committee, whether a hiring committee or promotion and tenure committee, may not take that work seriously because it's published in a Canadian journal. And dealing with the national sense of inferiority is a problem, a very serious issue. Does it exist in the Francophonie?
To some respect, yes.
Yeah. Is there a feeling that if you've got anthropology, speaking anthropologie et société, it's not as good as if it were in L'Homme?
Yeah, a bit of that, probably, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what one deals with. I mean, it's a solitary pursuit. And you have to learn to dot the letter I across the letter T. And you have to realize that you are in a profession where you may have senior colleagues or famous colleagues that have done better fieldwork than you, have done marvelous syntheses of that fieldwork, and they cannot put together a bibliography and they cannot spell.
By colleagues, you mean persons in the profession, not immediate colleagues.
Not immediate colleagues,
Persons,
but persons
well known in the profession.
Well known in the anthropological profession. Because was it actually my colleagues
are excellent spellers.
Are excellent. Although Harriet had one at another institution before she came to Canada who could not spell the word medieval.
But he didn't stay in anthropology.
He became a senior Republican official.
Where it's not necessary to spell the word medieval.
He spelled it M-I-D-E-V-I-L. So, I think that if there's a lesson in all this, it's that, Casca is going to have to fight, both to support its own journal, to get its members, if necessary, to pay a bit more for the journal, and also as the bodies like the Canadian Association of Learned Journals need to do a more effective job about lobbying, because the conditions for journal editors in Canada are not the same as those in the United States. And my colleague who is editing the journal has no course relief. The press will give her 400 pages, or 400 manuscript pages, 300 journal pages to review in 5 days when she's teaching a full load. And no assistance. That is the reality of journal editing in Canada now. And Jasmine is the first of the editor for a while, since Willie Lem, who has not been a retiree. I was a retiree most of my term, and so was Naomi, who took over from. And, you have to find someone nearly dead to edit your journal. So that was when you were mentioning something about teaching.
Well, actually, teaching, writing, scholarship, various bits of advice that I got along the way that were incredibly useful to me, not just as a student, but throughout my career, that I think are worth passing on. One came from Anne Chowning, who told us on the first day of the required senior seminar that the reason why you're in university is to learn that not everything in a book is true. Or to be precise, not everything is true because it's in a book. And this is an incredibly hard thing to communicate to students, and it certainly is an awfully useful thing to remember. Most people who manage to become academics have already figured that out. In fact, a good bit of making your name in academia is what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence, trying to convince people that what you have to say is more true than what was previously in books, even if what you're saying turns out to be incredibly similar to what was previously in books. But that was useful. Rodney Needham told me something that definitely has informed every bit of writing I've done since. Every bit of writing we've done jointly, I've tried to impress it on Andy too. And it sometimes can make for stilted writing. It certainly can make for incredibly slow production, but I wish more people wrote this way. He said, every time you write a sentence, never mind a book, never mind an article, a sentence, you've got to ask yourself 3 questions. And if you can't answer them coherently, it goes. What do you mean? How do you know? And why is it here? And if you can't answer all those questions coherently about every sentence you ever write, take it out. And that is something I really do wish people would think about more. The third bit of advice I got from Rodney Needham I didn't take, and I kind of wish to this day I had, because my career might have turned out differently. Who knows, I might have made a useful contribution to knowledge. Might have been a disaster, but at least it would have been my disaster. Early in my career, I was bemoaning the fact that Oxford wasn't very good at getting people money, and I had no idea how to get a grant to do field work. And he said, well, what field work do you want to do that you can't get a grant for? I said, well, I would like to look at matrilineal in a contemporary society that was traditionally matrilineal, but has obviously grossly changed over the years. I'd like to look at matrilineal among the Crow. And he said, and why do you need a grant for that? I said, what do you mean, why do I need a grant? So he says, well, you're young, as yet you don't have any children, you're free to do what you like. As far as I know, there are no laws to stop you from erecting a tent in a campground out in Wyoming or Montana. Throw a tent in the trunk of your car and go and find some crow and ask them about matrilineal. You don't need a grant. And I thought this was horribly insensitive, and that my work wouldn't be taken seriously if it weren't grant supported, and it would be incredibly difficult and disorganized and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't do it. And I have often wondered what would have happened if I'd taken his advice. Might I indeed have written the best thing about the Crow since Lowie? I'll never know.
The best student in my year got no advice about doing field work at all and got no help with funding. And he was one of Evans Pritchard's last students.
But he did something equivalent to what Rodney told me to do, and he did do something.
He went to Iran during the reign of the Shah and taught for a year, and then did a year's field work. And his work was on literacy and how it was imparted in different societies. He didn't enjoy his time there. We met him by chance after he'd returned from Iran. I said, what's it like there? I said, it's a totalitarian fascist state. It's horrible. there's going to be a revolution sooner or later.
So,
But
but he did what I was afraid to do, and he did some darn good work.
yeah,
And so I would give people advice. If anyone tells you, just go out and do what you want to do and figure out a way to come through it and hope for the best.
you know,
Take the advice if you
you
can.
see, I thought I was going to do a Levi-Strauss when I was doing Maya cosmology, Aztec cosmology. And you don't need to do field work for that, you know. Oh, no. It might be an idea, but particularly if you're dealing with old texts, no. Of course, you have to have visual-spatial abilities, which I didn't have, but never mind that. On teaching, I would say that, of course, as I said earlier, we did a lot of undergraduate teaching, and we really enjoyed that. Some of the best teaching we did was when we held seminars, fourth-year seminars in the house, because we found that this is something where social class counts a lot, social rank. When Harriet taught at an elite university in the U.S., or an elite college, Smith College, for a few years, for young ladies, it was a place where Martin Luther King's daughter and Nixon's daughter went. Those kids weren't tongue-tied. They weren't afraid to express their opinions. That was part of their training, as much as horse riding was, and high fashion, right?
My students were not into high fashion.
Yeah, but the others might be into it. But, you know,
And I was another faculty member who was into horse riding, not any students.
oh,
I
I'm
knew.
sure, yeah,
There were, but they weren't any I knew.
yeah. But they were all
They had
elite.
never been silenced.
They'd been trained to speak.
That's much
And
more key to
what
whether
we
they
found
rode horses.
teaching the children of the petty bourgeoisie is that they don't have that confidence. They don't know how to speak. And they don't have the ability to express an opinion on things they know nothing about and things they know something about. And often the only way we could train people Socratically, train them to talk and train them to start arguing each other was to break down a barrier. And you can't do that in a classroom. And so we found we'd be dealing with fourth-year students who knew how to recite someone else's argument, but not how to internalize it, not how to express it. And we found the only way to break it down was to bring the seminar home. Things you can't do anymore because administrations get frantic that you might be seducing the students might be seducing you.
If they trip on the stairs,
If they trip on the stairs, the university will get sued, right? So the last time I tried to do this, that's what happened. They said, please don't, you'll get us sued. And
although I have sort of recreated a couple of my seminars on Facebook. I'm now in my 70s. The students in question are in their 40s. Some of them even in their 50s, and we're still having some of the same arguments that we were having back when I was in my 40s and they were in their 20s. So
Yeah.
it's happened accidentally, but it's sort of developed.
Yeah. You know, and we've, you know, teaching at non-elite universities, you mean everything. In one class, Harriet had...
That was my class.
That was your class. You could
I had in one class, it was a kinship class.
at Kent
At
State.
Kent State, I had one student who literally couldn't spell his name. He would sometimes put a hyphen in it and sometimes not put a hyphen in it, which he would do with many words in the English language. There was sort of a random sprinkling of hyphens through his work, and which wouldn't have been a problem really if the rest of the work had been any good, but it wasn't, sadly. Maybe if he'd had better training from early in his career, it would have been possible. I will say this, his parents at least had good politics. I know this because I got a really interesting plagiarized essay from him that began, Owing to bourgeois repression, the works of Lewis Henry Morgan are almost unavailable in the United States today. I thought this was kind of odd, as there was a book by Morgan assigned for the course that was in the bookstore. So I called him in and I asked him, where did you get the idea that the works, and there were no hyphens in this, so I immediately suspected something. I called him in and I asked him, where did you get the idea that the works of Lewis Henry Morgan were unavailable in the United States today? And he looked at me rather shamefaced and said, well, actually, I copied it from a socialist workers' encyclopedia that my parents had around the house from the 1930s. So he eventually got arrested for purse snatching in the registration line.
It had a hyphen.
But anyway, purse snatching, yes, as I. But anyway, so that was one student in this class. In between were your usual level of people who could more or less memorize my lectures with more or less errors. But at the other end was someone who, after my lecture on confidential analysis, which most of the class found unintelligible, said, are people taking this seriously? It's the most simple-minded application of set theory I'd have ever seen. And somehow I had to manage to keep a class relevant to both of these extremes and everything in the middle.
His field work was on grammaticality and the absence of deep structures in Wildbury talk. He ended up as...
well, he didn't end up. He went through a phase and then he left.
He went... before going to SUNY Stony Brook, which offered him a position at the same university as his wife, he taught at MIT, where he was asked to take Chomsky's courses while Chomsky was on sabbatical. He was given tenure there.
So
and he was in the same class.
So basically, in the same class, I had to deal with someone who thought confidential analysis was a simple-minded application of set theory, and somebody that couldn't quite spell his name.
Sometimes you appreciate this. These stories are beyond belief. You don't know where to go. This is, I think, technically what's called the displaced middle in semantically, or the displaced middle term. I'll explain. I had a student. You didn't want to fail anybody in Ohio in 1970 because they might get drafted for the military. On the other hand, sometimes on individual assignments, it was impossible. I had an essay paper which dealt with audible reflections on cannibalism and acculturation. Since acculturation, the Urhobo deny that they ever had human sacrifice and cannibalism. But in odd moments they will admit that they had it. And now, of course, they no longer wear traditional dress. All this was expressed in a remarkably old-fashioned ethnography by Francis Huxley, which Lévi-Strauss liked, called Affable Savages. And this was a book which enabled me to introduce an Amazonian cosmology of the type that was dealt with in Mythologique, in a very elementary level, and you could do a structural analysis of it, though Huxley was not a structuralist, though he knew his Lévi-Strauss. So I gave them this book to read, and because the myths were marvelous, they read them. But then I got the essay, and this poor guy got just about nothing right. I gave him 18% because there were 2 correct facts on the paper, and the rest was a mess. So he asked what was wrong. He always got 80s at high school in English. So I said, well, you don't know the book very well. And I said, this question asked for this, it's not there. That's not there. This isn't there. That's what has to be there. But then there's your English. But nobody ever criticized my English. Well, what does this sentence mean? And this, and this. suddenly something catches my eye. Since the tribe are no longer cannibalistic, comma,